Meanwhile, as they impoverish you, and as they tell you that we are going to have to lower our economic estimates because of climate justice and environmental justice and white supremacy and all the rest of the silly progressive buzzwords, as they tell you that the best you can hope for is to one day work at a wind turbine factory with a government unionized job, as they do that, they are giving lottery tickets to illegal immigrant families. That's exciting stuff. According to the Wall Street Journal, the United States is currently in talks to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to families separated at the border. Okay, again, this is kind of incredible. And so Americans are experiencing wild, out-of-control inflation. There are 10 million open jobs and people aren't getting back in the workforce. We have supply chain bottlenecks. Joe Biden is pledging to basically lower his economic growth estimates to below 2% a year for the rest of time. But we have enough money in the bank to be paying, I kid you not, $450,000 per person in compensation to immigrant families separated by the Trump administration. There are several agencies working to resolve lawsuits filed on behalf of parents and children who say the government subjected them to lasting psychological trauma. The U.S. Departments of Justice, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services are considering payments that could amount to close to $1 million a family. Though the final numbers could shift, people familiar with the matter said most of the families that crossed the border illegally from Mexico to seek asylum in the United States included one parent and one child, the person said. Many families would likely get smaller payments depending on their circumstances. The ACLU has identified about 5,500 kids separated at the border over the course of the Trump administration, citing figures provided to it by the government. The number of families eligible under the potential settlement is expected to be smaller. About 940 claims have so far been filed by the families. The potential payout could be $1 billion or more. So remember, there is a zero-tolerance enforcement policy in which the United States would not just release illegal immigrants into the interior of the United States after giving them a piece of paper saying, come back in a month. The Trump administration said, we're not doing that. If you come, you will be held until you actually have your asylum date, until we find out whether you are here or whether you're here for good reason or whether you're just trying to cross the border illegally. Now, there was something called the Flores settlement. The Flores settlement said that kids could not be held with their parents in confinement. So instead, kids were separated from parents. Very often they were handed to a relative. Sometimes they'd be put in a holding facility for a little while. Right? But that was because of the Flores settlement. It was defined by law. The two choices were release the entire family unit into the interior, or two, don't, and you have to separate the kids from the parents by law because of the stupid Flores settlement. So that's what the Trump administration did. Now, if you were one of the illegal immigrants who came with your kid and your kid was separated from you, the government is going to sign you a $450,000 check per person. So for your kid and for you. So not only did you get to enter the United States illegally, you also get a giant check from the U.S. government signed by the taxpayer. Isn't that exciting stuff from the Biden administration? The lawsuits allege some of the children suffered from a range of ailments, including heat exhaustion and malnutrition, were kept in freezing cold rooms and provided little medical attention. That is indeed terrible. You know what else is a really bad idea? Paying people for the separation of the family required by law when they cross the border. You want to incentivize illegal immigration? Don't just say, come on over here and we got a bunch of free welfare benefits and we're not going to kick you out. Say, if we happen to separate you because we have to by law, we will sign you $1 million check. That's crazy towns. In recent months, lawyers for the families and government have told courts overseeing the cases they are engaged in settlement negotiations. Legal Earned, deputy director of the ACLU, says, quote, President Biden has agreed that the family separation policy is a historic moral stain on our nation that must be fully remedied. That remedy must include not only meaningful monetary compensation, but a pathway to remain in the country. So again, remember that they are not only pushing for a giant check, they're also pushing for people to just get to stay here. In his first weeks in office, Biden pledged to reunite the separated families. By the way, not all the families have been reunited, even still. Senator Tom Cotton said the Biden administration's promises of citizenship and entitlement programs have already caused the worst border crisis in history. A huge cash reward will make it even worse. Some government lawyers view the payouts as excessive for people who had violated the law by crossing the border. One government lawyer threatened to remove his name from the case out of disagreement with the potential settlement offer. In another instance, a Department of Homeland Security attorney involved in the settlement talks complained on a conference call the payouts could amount to more than some families of 9/11 victims received. So, if that's the case, think about the insane moral illogic of that. You cross the border illegally with your kid because you're attempting to get into the country illegally. You're separated. The government says, here's $1 million check and you get to stay in the country. Now, you're a family member of somebody who got vaporized on 9/11 by a terror attack on the World Trade Center. You get a lower check than the illegal immigrant who just crossed the border for pain and suffering. That's unbelievable. Trying to take the cases to trial would be unpredictable, with juries potentially awarding larger sums to the families, said legal experts. Damaged class actions in this kind of case are pretty rare. It's hard to think of a recent comparison, said Margot Schlanger, who ran the Civil Rights Office during the Obama administration. It's a complicated, complex piece of litigation to try to resolve hundreds of different lawsuits at the same time, sometimes even more complex to try the cases. Many of the families filed tort claims, a type of civil claim seeking damages for loss or harm. Some of the cases were resolved under the Trump administration. In a 2019 settlement in New Jersey, for example, an adult and a minor received a total of $125,000. Many of those cases were still pending at the start of the Biden administration. But again, the fact that this administration is now considering a widespread policy of just giving money to people for this sort of thing, like, pretty insane. Making illegal immigrant families rich, making American families poor. That is a hell of an, and making everybody dependent. Illegal, non-illegal, everybody dependent on the federal government. You wonder why the economic boom is stalling out? You wonder why a feeling of enervation has settled across the American population when it comes to work? This would be the reason. You have an entire side of the political aisle in the United States that basically now says that work is unnecessary. You shouldn't aspire to anything. The government will take care of you cradle to grave. If you don't want to vote for that, then vote for Glenn Youngkin if you're in Virginia. And if you don't like it, don't vote for Democrats across the country in 2022. I still think that most Americans have aspirations to live more than the life of Linda. If that's the case, then Democrats have a real cruising coming to them. Then Democrats have a real bruising coming to them in 2022. The battle for the culture is heating up. We here at the Daily Wire are making some big moves. So be sure to like, subscribe, ring that bell, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment.